debate between Congressman Jerry Moran and Todd Tiahrt. The candidates are seeking to replace Republican Senator Sam Brownback, who's running for governor this fall. Some of the topics: tax policy, Arizona's immigration law, and prosecuting suspected terrorists in military tribunals. KSN TV in Topeka, Kansas is hosting the event. It's just under an hour.
In 2011, Kansas will be celebrating 150 years since entering the United States and becoming the 34th state in the Union. Kansas will also be getting a new U.S. Senator, with incumbent Sam Brownback leaving office to run for governor. Two candidates hope to get your vote in the Republican primary on August 3rd.
I'm a candidate for the United States Senate. As I told Todd, at the end of the day, I want us to remain friends and allies. We have a lot of work to do over the next 2 years.
Congressman Jerry Moran has represented western Kansas and the 1st Congressional District since 1997. Before that, he was a member of the Kansas State Senate from 1988 to 1996. Congressman Todd Tiahrt has represented southeastern Kansas and the 4th Congressional District since 1995. Before that, he was a member of the Kansas State Senate from 1992 to 1994. Both candidates have been re-elected time and again from their own congressional districts, but now each wants to move to the U.S. Senate and represent the entire state. Both candidates have been running hard for the August 3rd vote, and now it's time for their first televised debate. 27 KSNT, Fox 43 KTMJ, KSN Wichita, KSHB Kansas City, the Topeka Capital Journal, and the McPherson Sentinel present the Republican primary debate for U.S. Senate between Congressman Jerry Moran and Congressman Todd Tiahrt.
Good evening. I'm 27 News anchor Kelly Stegeman.
And I'm 27 News political analyst Dr. Bob Beatty. Thank you for joining us on this special night.
We'd like to welcome you to the first televised debate between Congressman Jerry Moran and Congressman Todd Tiahrt, Republican candidates for U.S. Senate in the upcoming August 3rd primary. Gentlemen, thank you for being here this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For the next hour, these two Senate candidates will be fielding questions from a variety of sources, including the 27 News staff, 27 News viewers, and questions submitted to the co-sponsors of this debate: KSN in Wichita, KSHB in Kansas City, the Topeka Capital Journal, and the McPherson Sentinel.
We will also be taking questions from you at home during this debate. If you have a question that pertains to both candidates, send your questions via email to debate@ksnt.com.
In order to cover as much ground as possible, we've asked the candidates to keep their answers to a minute and a half, with 30 seconds allotted for the 2 rounds of rebuttals. And with that, we'll get to the first question.
And this question goes first to Congressman Tiahrt. And this question comes from staff at 27 News and the Topeka Capital Journal. From both of your campaigns, there has been much discussion about who is the true conservative. There's also been quite a bit of back and forth on the issue of who lives where and has spent the most time in the state. Please discuss what being conservative means in comparison to your opponent, and also amplify why it should matter to voters where you live.
Well, Kelly, thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Channel 27, KSNT, and the staff here, and also the other sponsors for this opportunity. It's great to be with Dr. Beatty and Kelly. First of all, I want to say that this is a very important election. Kansas is going to send a Republican to the Senate. The question is, what kind of a senator do you want? And I think it's important in the challenges that we're facing. We are in debt by almost $14 trillion. We have an economy that's flat. We have people who are trying to attack this country. And it's important that we send somebody who's a leader, who can get things done. Somebody who's not a compromiser like a John McCain, who would compromise on taxes. We want somebody who's strong like a Sarah Palin, who would make sure that this country gets back on track. Now, I've lived in Kansas for 27 years, been in my house for 27 years. I also work in Washington. Jerry Moran and I spend the same amount of time in Washington. And so the issue of where you live really isn't an issue. What is an issue is who has the best record on fighting taxes, who has the best record of getting things done for Kansas, who has the best record of listening to people and then taking those problems and doing something about it. And I think I've got that record. You know, what we want for our kids is for them to have the opportunity to either start a good business or get a good job. And my policies for getting the economy back on track, I think, is the best, and that's why I'm asking for your vote on August 3rd to send me to Washington to be a senator.
Okay, and for you, Congressman Moran.
Well, again, appreciate the opportunity to join the two of you and our viewers this evening. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with Congressman Tiahrt. First of all, I would say that we take very seriously Kansas common sense and good judgment. I think the people of our state have a lot to offer elected officials, and conversations with them result in good decisions in Washington, D.C. And it's one of the reasons that my family and I made the decision to remain in Hays, to travel every week now for 14 years to Washington, D.C., to spend 4 or 5 days each week in our nation's capital, but return home every weekend. In addition to that, and what that means is it's church on Sunday, it's the grocery store, it's the post office. It means that you have conversations with everyday normal Kansans, and they bring you back to reality. In addition to that, I do 69 town hall meetings every year, one in each of the counties that comprise the 1st Congressional District of Kansas, which again gives me the opportunity to make certain that I stay in touch with how Kansans feel about issues. And Kansans are generally conservative. They want conservative, common sense solutions to the problems in Washington, D.C. And I've taken that view to Washington, D.C. from day one. It's even more important now that we are conservative in our approach, particularly to our fiscal issues that our country faces. Our country is financially bankrupt, and it means that we can no longer afford to do the things, business as usual, politics the same. It is absolutely essential that on taxes and spending, we have a conservative voice in our nation's capital for the future of our country.
And your 30-second response, Congressman Tiahrt.
Well, I think that it's very important that we send somebody who is going to make sure that our values are represented in a fashion where we can't be pushed around. You know, it's difficult for many members of Congress when they go to Washington, D.C., they try to be loved by everybody. I know that I won't be loved by the unions, the government unions. I know that I won't be loved by the environmentalists. I know that I won't be loved by the bureaucracy. But I will fight for Kansas values, for lower taxes, smaller government, for more individual freedom. And I'll do it in a fashion that I think will make Kansas proud.
I've been a conservative in Republican days and in Democrat days as well. I think it's easier, I suppose, to oppose Democrat policies, and I'm one of 17 to have voted against every stimulus package, every bailout, opposed cash for clunkers, cap and trade, financial reform, health care reform, all the things that are now growing our government. But I also opposed those issues when Republicans were in charge and spent too much money, borrowed too much money, and grew government in ways that we cannot afford. And so I'm very consistent in my approach to government, whether it's Republican spending or Democrat spending. The answer has to be no.
In response?
Seconds.
Well, I think that, you know, I didn't know it was my turn for response, but what I want to drive, the point I want to drive home is that now is not the time for people who have compromised on taxes, for people who have been involved with the government and supported by government unions. Now is the time for us to be very secure in what we're doing as far as fighting for tax relief, for regulatory reform, to get health care back in the private sector, to become energy secure, and to have litigation reform. That's how we're going to get our economy back on track, because we're going to build it from the ground up, not the government down.
You have 30 more seconds.
First member of the House of Representatives to introduce a bill to repeal Obamacare, and clearly that is the direction that we must go. In addition to that, have opposed the stimulus and bailout packages that are bankrupting our country, and believe in earmark reform, elimination or reform to stop the spending that is out of control in Washington, D.C. So Congressman Tiahrt and I differ in some respects in this regard. He's a member of the Spending Committee, the Appropriations Committee, and I've also voted for lowering taxes over 200 times.
Well, a number of these issues I think we'll be getting into in detail throughout this debate. Let's go to question 2. It comes from the staff of the McPherson Sentinel and has also been in many of the viewer emails to us. And the question is, earmarks have a negative connotation among many voters. However, earmarks can provide much needed funding for important community projects such as the McPherson Opera House, which has brought people and dollars to the town's Main Street. What is your stance on earmarks, and if elected to the U.S. Senate, would you continue securing earmarks for your constituents? And we start with a 1.5-minute response from Congressman Moran.
Well, I oppose earmarks in their current state and supported the moratorium that finally came about in the House of Representatives. We tried for 2 years to get Republicans to agree not to request earmarks, and we were successful. In fact, I was one of 30 members of the House of Representatives to sign the petition asking Republican leaders to have a conference meeting of Republican House members to bring to a vote the idea of an earmark reform moratorium. And so the moratorium is now in place. Only 2 or 3 members, Republican members of the House of Representatives, are violating that moratorium. It should have been put in place years before. Congressman Tiahrt led the effort to keep the earmark process in place, has argued about earmarks in public versus in private. And I think that the change over time is our country is bankrupt. It is financially broke, and earmarks lend themselves toward members of Congress voting for $1.6 trillion bills because there's a $500,000 earmark in the bill. And with a financially broke country, it means we have to do something different than business as usual. There may be, at various times, a reason for an earmark, but they have become ways of life in Congress. And in fact, members of Congress often are given a pot of money and say, go find a way to spend this money. That's a terrible mistake, and it originates with the Appropriations Committee, in which Todd has been a longtime member. And so we have clear differences in regard to this question of earmarks.
Congressman Tiahrt?
Well, when you listen to Congressman Moran, you think that I'm the only one in Washington or from Kansas that does earmarks. In fact, everybody from Kansas requests earmarks. In fact, just last year, Congressman Moran supported and requested more than $250 million in earmarks. Now, that's according to his website, so I just take it for what it's worth. But I have to tell you that I have stood with Senator Roberts and Senator Brownback to make sure that we supported our communities. And when the levees were failing in Ark City and in Winfield, and they had cried out for 20 years for somebody to build them, it was an earmark that started that process, just like Congressman Moran started an earmark for levees in Salina. Also, Senator Roberts and I worked very hard to make sure that our national security was not outsourced. You know, our Pentagon has tried to outsource jobs, and the only thing that we have been able to do is use earmarks in order to keep those national security jobs from being outsourced. Unfortunately, Congressman Moran voted against those Kansas jobs and supported outsourcing our national security on eminent fury. So earmarks, I think, have been misunderstood. I have the earmark reform bill, one of the strongest ones in the House, that would put transparency in earmarks. It would not only include the House and the Senate, but also the White House. And unlike today, when you would vote up or down on an earmark, if it is defeated, it would lower the debt. And I think that's where this country ought to go. And that's why I think that the Tea Party Express has endorsed me as well as Sarah Palin.
Well, Congressman Tiahrt talks about earmarks that benefit Kansans. And the reality is that we now have a process generally led by Congressman Flake from Arizona, who has endorsed my candidacy. He brings these amendments to the House floor to take out the most egregious earmarks in a bill. And again, Congressman Tiahrt and I have voted differently in regard to removing earmarks. Todd voted for the San Francisco Pelosi earmark related to the bridge, the airport for Democrat member Mr. Murtha, and for $400,000 for an indoor tennis court in Wichita. There are differences.
And your response?
Well, the airport that Congressman Moran's talking about has an Army Guard unit for Apache helicopters there. But he has a weak record on national security, and I think that's why he supports constitutional rights for terrorists. It's just part of his weak record on national security. And earmarks is something that I think ought to go through the reform process so we can lower the cost. That's why I think my bill is important. It adds transparency and includes earmarks from the Senate and the House and the White House. And also when we vote to eliminate an earmark, it would reduce the debt. And I think that's important.
Congressman Rand, one more rebuttal.
Only would say that Congressman Tiahrt is a sponsor of legislation for earmark reform, but the Congressional Daily reports his efforts that he led the effort to prevent a moratorium from being placed on earmarks by Republicans the year before we were actually successful in bringing it about. So this is he's coming to this conclusion, but it happens to be an election year.
You have 30 more seconds.
Yeah, well, as I recall, Jerry, you were in that meeting, in that Republican conference, and you supported my motion. So you supported the very motion you're chastising me for on this. I support earmark reform, and I think my legislation is the best vehicle to do that. Jerry Moran supported the efforts that he's now criticizing me for, which I find a little bit humorous. But the truth is, what we have to do is make sure that we have transparency in the earmark process, that we make sure that includes every facet of government today, and that when we do have a chance to eliminate them, that it does reduce the national debt.
Now for question number 3, this is a popular topic among several 27 News viewers, readers of the Topeka Capital Journal, even a voter in the town of Bison, Kansas. It has to do with the economy and the stimulus and bailout packages. And the question is, what would each of you have done instead of these programs, and would the economy and unemployment rate of Kansas now be better or worse if your ideas had been implemented? Congressman Tiahrt.
Well, I think the bailouts and the stimulus have been a bad economic policy. You can't borrow and spend your way into prosperity. The government doesn't create wealth. And when you borrow money and start new programs, as the Obama administration has been doing, you simply just put us further in debt and postpone the inevitable. And that's the problems we're going through with today. Here we have 19 months since the Democrats have taken over. We've lost hundreds of thousands of jobs, millions of jobs. In fact, since the Democrats took over the House, 7.9 million jobs. If you want to get the economy going again, you do 5 simple things. You lower taxes, you reform regulations, you return health care to the private sector, you become energy independent, and you have litigation reform. Now, I've started the Economic Competitiveness Caucus about 8 years ago to highlight these barriers that the federal government has created. My time at the Boeing Company as a proposal manager, where I had to account for every penny the Boeing Company spent and assure a reasonable profit, gave me a good economics background so that I understand what we need to do to get people, get the economy going so that our kids and ourselves can either start a good business or get a good job. This administration has been going in the exact opposite direction by continuing to borrow money. That's why I think it's so important that we do not have somebody who will compromise on taxes. Congressman Moran has voted 12 times to increase taxes. He has voted to increase property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes. I can't think of a tax that he hasn't tried to increase. Now is not the time for people who have compromised on tax relief. Now is the time to do those 5 simple things to get the economy rolling again.
And Congressman Moran.
Again, have voted more than 200 times for lower taxes and believe that it is tax reform that is necessary for us to grow our economy. Having voted against all of the stimulus and bailout packages, including TARP, you will get nothing but an argument from me that those proposals are disastrous for the United States, its economy, and its future. We're very short-sighted, in fact, immoral. We are spending money today that we cannot afford to spend in hopes that it stimulates the economy and expecting the next generation of Americans to pick up the tab. So every time I have voted no. That's different than Todd and I. And again, you cannot spend, as Todd says, or borrow your way to prosperity. And so the direction that we're going is a terrible mistake for today and for tomorrow. And I would say that it does take tax reform, tax reductions. There are certain taxes that can help us grow the economy. Estate taxes, capital gains tax rates are onerous and difficult for the economy. I also would say that the fair tax is an opportunity for us to change the dynamic of our economy in a dramatic way. I'm a sponsor of the fair tax legislation and believe that it can create jobs. I also think that we have to have an energy policy, and unfortunately the health care policy developed by Obama and Pelosi are disastrous, not only for the access to affordable health care, but to the overall economy because of the taxes increased and the additional rules and regulations that are placed upon Americans. A terrible scenario of events have occurred over the last few months.
For your 30-second rebuttal.
Well, Congressman Moran says he's voted to lower taxes by 200 times, and I'm very thankful for that. Why couldn't it have been 212? Why did he have to vote against the Bush tax cuts? Why did he have to vote against eliminating permanently death tax? Those things are very critical. I mean, the Bush tax cuts were very significant. In fact, December 31st this year, because Congressman Moran bailed out on the Bush tax cuts, we ended up with temporary tax cuts that expire on December 31st this year. We can't send somebody who is going to compromise on the things that we need to do to get this economy going again.
Those are very disingenuous statements. I have voted every time the Bush tax cuts have been before Congress in 2003 and 2005 for those Bush tax cuts. The only thread that Congressman Tiahrt uses to try to make this a true statement was, I voted against the resolution that created the budget in advance of those tax cuts. And that resolution included the tax cuts, but it also included an increase in spending of 4%. And I wrote an opinion piece to our Kansas newspapers to say, while we're cutting taxes, a good thing, Republicans have to do a better job of slowing the growth of spending. 4% is too much.
Well, I'm glad Congressman Moran agrees that he did vote against the Bush tax cuts. And I think it's important that every farmer and every small business owner know that he opposed a permanent reduction and elimination, a permanent elimination of death tax. That's something that, my family lost their farm because of the death tax. I will never miss an opportunity to vote against the death tax. So I was very disappointed when Congressman Moran voted against a permanent repeal of the death tax.
30 seconds.
Never voted against the Bush tax cuts, never. And in regard to estate taxes, the Farm Bureau, Kansas's largest farm organization, 110,000 members have endorsed me. It's one of their primary issues. And in fact, the first speech I ever gave on the House floor was about the importance of eliminating the estate tax for purposes of preserving family businesses in Kansas, ranches and farms. This is simply a fabrication.
All right, for the next question, we're continuing on the hot button issue of the economy, focusing on the massive federal deficit, which now totals trillions of dollars. And 27 News viewer Steve from Topeka asked the question, most economic experts contend that the only solution to America's debt problem is to deal with structural debt caused by Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid through changes in policies involving possible reduction in benefits along with increases in revenues. Do you agree with Steve? And if you disagree, what is your solution to the U.S. debt problem, which we've already discussed a little bit? First response comes from Congressman Moran.
Well, Steve, thank you for your question. It's one of the most serious issues our country faces, and any kind of effort at changing our debt into the future revolves around structural reform. But in addition to that, at this point in our country's economy, we cannot raise taxes. And so any increase in FICA or withholding taxes on employers or employees would be a terrible mistake. So raising taxes is not an option. Congress ought to look at long-term incremental changes in the Social Security system that will provide benefits over debt reduction benefits over a long period of time. But really, the truth is, if we're going to address our deficit issue, it's about changing our tax code, eliminating rules and regulations, and allowing the American people to go to work. How you get out of a recession is entrepreneurs and small business men and women believe they have an idea to bring to market, and we've got to get government out of the way. We have so many hurdles that it's, and much of that has to do with the uncertainty of what Washington is doing today. What business person in their right mind is going to grow their business when they're uncertain about what is going to happen with health care, what's going to happen with cap and trade, and now what's going to happen with financial re-regulation. We have got to free up the credit market so businesses can expand and put people back to work. And unfortunately, Congress has just passed legislation that makes that much less likely for Kansas banks and financial institutions, and means that small business and entrepreneurs are going to have less of a likelihood of being able to access capital.
Congressman Tiahrt?
Well, this question is very important because when you talk about Medicare and Medicaid, these are entitlements. These are money that we're going to spend, and it's important that we find ways to reduce the cost associated with them. I contributed to and co-sponsored a bill called H.R. 3400. It, according to the Government Accountability Office, would have lowered health care costs by 10% for Medicare and for Medicaid. That's exactly what we need to do, and it was a pretty simple plan. It addressed the cost centers within health care to help reduce them. Defensive medicine is a cost that is about 30% of healthcare today. And in making sure that we can protect defensive people, doctors and nurses from lawsuits, can lower the defensive medicine costs. These are policies and procedures that they do to protect themselves from lawsuit and are not required by the injury or the illness. Other things we need to do is have medical malpractice reform. We also need to make sure that we have regulatory reform for healthcare, because that's, in Kansas hospitals, it takes 1.1 hours to do the paperwork and for every hour of health care. So there's more paperwork than health care. Litigation reform is all tied into all of these, and that's very difficult to get litigation reform in Congress today. Right now, over half of Congress is lawyers. And because of that, it's just very difficult. It's like pushing rope uphill to get litigation reform. But with litigation reform, we can lower medical malpractice costs, we can lower liability costs, we can lower defensive medicine costs, and you couple that with regulatory reform, we can have a 10% reduction. That would help us reduce the debt that we have in this country.
Congressman Moran?
President Obama and Speaker Pelosi talked about bending the health care curve so that we would reduce the cost of Medicare and Medicaid for states and for the federal government. Unfortunately, it bends the cost curve, but it bends it up. And it's now been rescored by CBO and the CMS, the agency that manages Medicare and Medicaid services. And we are increasing the cost of health care, not decreasing it. One of the things that a Republican Congress could have done is not spend $700 billion added to the deficit with the Medicare Modernization Act passed during the days of Republican Congress.
For you.
Well, as I recall, Jerry, you sent a letter to the Republican leadership asking for more money to be in Part D of health care. In fact, I've got a copy of the letter here with me today. So to act like you're a conservative now and you oppose it when you ask for more money, even told leadership you would vote for it, it seems a little bit disingenuous. I think that what my plan is to lower health care costs on HR 3400 is a better way to approach this, and I wish that you would join us on this effort by co-sponsoring this legislation to help bring down the cost by 10%. I think if you joined on board, it's possible that we could get possibly a hearing, even under a Democrat House.
Again, the largest increase in entitlement spending occurred with Todd Tiahrt's vote, an increase of $700 billion directly to the bottom line, the deficit of our country. It is something that I voted against after telling the leadership and asking me the question, if we need your vote, if we just need your vote and you're the one that can pass this bill, will you vote with us? And the answer was, I'm sorry, this bill is so bad, that would be all the more reason to vote no. So I misled no one about my position on this bill. And again, it's an example of how Republicans mismanaged our federal government when they had the majority.
Well, Congressman Moran, you asked for more money to be put into the bill. I was on the whip team at the time. You told the leadership you would vote for the bill. Then you voted against it and left the floor. And when you got back in Kansas, you said it didn't do enough for seniors. So to act like you're a fiscal conservative now and chastise me for doing something that you said you were going to do, I don't think it's going to be cut it with. I don't think it's going to cut it with the Kansas voters. This is, I think, the idea of lowering healthcare costs is important. We can get there, but we can't by failing to hold true to our word when it comes time to vote.
All right, it is now time for our first break from the 27 News 2010 Republican Senate primary debate for Kansas. And don't forget, we are taking questions from you, the viewer, that could be asked in our last segment. To send in a question that pertains to both candidates, email debate@ksnt.com. We're back after this.
Welcome back.
And if you have a question for either of the candidates, please email debate@ksnt.com. Now, let's get to this next question. It received the most attention from viewers and readers across Northeast Kansas. Many of the emails expressed a great frustration that elected officials in Washington have not been able to get together and do something about immigration. And with the ability of the U.S. Senate to filibuster or stop legislation with as few as 40 votes, it doesn't seem possible that this issue is going to be resolved without some sort of compromise between Democrats and Republicans. Explain your position on this issue and also explain what you would do as a U.S. Senator that would have a realistic chance of ending this political impasse between the parties. And first, we'll go to Congressman Tiahrt.
Well, certainly immigration is a big challenge today. I read on the news today where if we had stopped illegal immigration and had everybody who was here without legal status gone home, that California and New York could have balanced their state budgets. It's clearly a problem. My solution for immigration is just simply 3 words: build the fence. Now, we have a lot of challenges in what has been happening with them coming in with our challenges in our healthcare system, challenges in our school systems. I've listened to the constituents. I've studied this issue a lot, and I realize without the fence we can't solve the problem. It's also very important that we make sure that we also make sure that it's a northern border is also included in this as well. I was very disappointed to see that Congressman Moran voted against sanctuary cities, cities that protect illegal immigrants, because I think it's important that we not protect illegal immigrants while they're here. Also, Congressman Moran voted to have bilingual ballots, and I think that encourages people to come in. And he also voted with Nancy Pelosi on the state child health insurance program, which eliminated citizenship requirements for health care. So today, American taxpayers are paying for the health insurance of illegals. Now, Kansas even had to pass a law to prevent that from happening here in Kansas. So it's a very serious issue. But I think the first thing we got to do is build the fence.
Congressman Moran.
The first step in any immigration policy is to enforce our laws, and the most important laws are at our border. We cannot have the borders that we have in this country. In fact, the primary responsibility of the federal government is to defend our country, and that includes border security. The federal government has failed. I'm a strong supporter of what the governor and legislature in Arizona are doing. And I find it very odd that Congressman Tiahrt lectures me about issues on immigration when on 2 occasions he's a co-sponsor of legislation called the DREAM Act, which provides amnesty and in-state tuition for children of those who are here illegally, and in his campaign literature argued for driver's licenses for those who are here illegally in the United States. These are terrible mistakes, particularly when you look at national security, as Congressman Tiahrt likes to talk about. 18 of the 19 terrorists had U.S. identities, and providing driver's licenses would be a national security risk. So Congress is working its way through so-called immigration reform. Nothing will work until we enforce our borders. If you do something about immigration today, all it means is that more people will come to the United States because the border is so porous, and those who ought to be returned to their home country, if we return them, will only come back because there is no effort at the border to control. I talked to a gentleman in Kansas this week who told me it was easier to get across the Mexican border the same week that he crossed the Canadian border. It was much more difficult at Canada. We have a terrible immigration system that demands law enforcement.
And for your response.
Well, some time ago, a long time ago, I thought it was compassionate to not punish the children for the parents' sins. But I've listened to the people of Kansas. I've studied this issue. I've looked at the cost associated with this issue. I've looked at the crime that comes from illegal immigration, and I've come to the conclusion that we must build a fence, that we must say no to amnesty, that we must do the things necessary to make sure that people are only here on legal status, only here on legal status. That's why it was so disappointing when Jerry supported sanctuary cities, which protected illegals and not send them back to their country of origin. No amnesty, build the fence.
Congressman Moran?
I've voted numerous times in support of eliminating sanctuary cities. That's a phrase that means that communities can give sanctuary to people who are illegally. It's a terrible idea. It's wrong, and I've opposed it numerous times. And in fact, the leader of immigration issues, border security, Tom Tancredo, is a supporter of mine. I don't think he would be supporting me under the allegations of Congressman Tiahrt. So it is, this is a very important issue, and it's also not just about immigration, but it's about national security, and it's about law enforcement. The greatest crime problem we face in Kansas today is about drugs, and the problem is coming across the border.
For you?
Well, drugs that coming across our border is important. We do, I agree with the Arizona law. I think it's important that we enforce the laws of our land. What we see in the lawsuit that was filed today is absolutely wrong. I joined with Lamar Smith in a letter sent to the President, also sent to the Attorney General to ask them to drop the charges. I've also sent a letter to our Attorney General to have him join in to make sure that we don't do the same thing here in Kansas. So if we don't build the fence, we're not going to solve the problem. Immigration reform has to start with 3 words: build the fence.
30 seconds.
Only would say that it is important that, in fact, let me just say it this way. It is a silly use of resources, money, for our federal government to sue Arizona. They ought to be using the money that they're going to spend on litigation to improve border security. They ought to use that money to enforce the law. What a silly use of taxpayer dollars to challenge Arizona and their constitutionality of enforcing the law. All Arizona is doing is trying to protect life and property of the citizens of the state of Arizona. They ought to be applauded, not sued.
All right, the next question heads into the realm of foreign policy. The chairman of the Republican Party, Michael Steele, recently said that President Obama does not understand that the one thing you don't do is engage in a land war in Afghanistan because, quote, everyone who has tried over 1,000 years of history has failed, unquote. And a few days ago, conservative columnist George Will wrote that, quote, the American undertaking in Afghanistan is a fool's errand, unquote, and likened it to Vietnam. These are pretty strong voices saying that Afghanistan could be a quagmire. Do you agree? And if you don't, please tell the voters what specifically our mission is in Afghanistan and how and when it's attainable. And we start with Congressman Moran.
Bob, I think our mission in Afghanistan is similar to our mission in Iraq, and that is to stabilize the country, allow the development of a government that functions, help reduce the corruption that erodes that government, and the decision about whether or not we belonged in Afghanistan was made on the day that President Bush decided to send troops to Afghanistan. And once we make that commitment, it's my view that we work hard to succeed. And I think it's especially important in Afghanistan. This is the site of where the terrorists trained, before they came to the United States and killed thousands of Americans. We need to recognize that that can return. That's another goal of our military effort in Afghanistan, is to make sure it doesn't become a base for terrorists in the future. And finally, Afghanistan is so important to us because of its neighboring Pakistan. And here the game changer is the fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and our ability to make certain that those nuclear weapons don't fall in the hands of those who want to kill Americans is in many ways determined by the stability of that area, including what happens in Afghanistan. And so from my perspective, the decision was made. Our military leaders believe that success can still occur, and I have faith in those military leaders if given the free rein and reduce the restrictions that the civilians place on our military leaders and the decisions they make about how to utilize those forces. I think we can still achieve that success.
Congressman Tiahrt?
Well, we have a constitutional requirement to protect the people of this land. And when we were attacked on September 11th, 2001, we realized that if we don't take the fight to the terrorists, they'll bring it home to us. So our troops, our brave men and women who put on the uniform, have taken the fight to the terrorists, and because they have done that, we haven't had any attacks from the outside on our homeland since September 11th, 2001. Now, there were many naysayers about the Iraqi surge. Joe Biden spoke against it. President Obama spoke against it when he was a senator. But given the right resources and the right emphasis, our troops can accomplish almost anything. They accomplished a significant amount in Iraq by making it a safe country, by bringing the Taliban, or excuse me, not the Taliban, by bringing the terrorists into control. Now, are they out of the woods yet in Afghanistan, or excuse me, in Iraq? No. In Iraq, there's still a lot of work to be done. But now we have naysayers or critics saying that Afghanistan is going to be a quagmire. It could become a quagmire if our president fails to give our troops the resources they need, if he fails to give the generals the number of troops that they need. I've been to Afghanistan several times. I've been on the Pakistan border. I've been in Kabul when mortars have been launched into the compound where I was staying. I've visited Pakistan as well. I know that there is a possibility for us to do a similar effort that we did in Iraq and get a functioning government where it's going to keep the Taliban from operating in Afghanistan and keep terrorist bases from training people and sending attackers against America. That's why we're here. God bless our troops. I'm glad they're there. They're doing a great job, and I fully support them.
Let me use this opportunity. I don't think there's rebuttal here with what Congressman Tiahrt said, but let me use the opportunity to praise our soldiers and their families. I represent the area that surrounds Fort Riley and recognize the tremendous sacrifice that's being made on behalf of our country and its future, and praise them and support them in every effort. I think we as Americans need to make sure we make the commitment to veterans and military retirees, keep the commitment that was made to those who serve our country.
And 30 seconds for you.
Every person that goes to war has some impact from their experience. When they come back, it's important that before they come into the United States that we give them an opportunity to test and make sure that they can adapt to the new life back in America. When they arrive in our country, it's important that we check with them and make sure they're adapting well after they've been here for about 6 months. In fact, the best program for troops who have come back with post-traumatic stress syndrome and traumatic brain injury resides in Fort Riley, Kansas, and we ought to be very, very proud of the battalion and the work that they're doing. Let's take care of our troops. They're serving us. We want to keep them safe. We want them to have a great life when they get back to America.
Okay, and let's go ahead and move on to that next question. 27 News viewer John from Topeka sent in the following question regarding something we've heard a lot about tonight, healthcare reform. Both of you are campaigning to overturn the Healthcare Reform Act, is what John says. And what would you keep from the Healthcare Reform Act, or would you just abolish it altogether? And we'll go first with you, Congressman Tiahrt.
Well, the healthcare reform, or Obamacare as it's sometimes called, I think is going to be a disaster. It will lead to more expensive healthcare, eventually to rationing. We're already seeing some doctors question whether they will stay in the business or whether they will retire early. It's going to be cheaper for employers to pay the fee, the 8% payroll fee, and push their employees into Medicaid. When they do that, it's going to drive up the cost for states like Kansas, which contribute a portion of that. It'll drive up the cost for the federal government. The best thing that needs to happen in healthcare is to move it back to the private sector. In addition to that, we ought to employ H.R. 3400, a bill that addresses defensive medicine, litigation cost, medical malpractice cost, regulatory reform, and more free market forces in the healthcare. By doing that, we can lower cost. While I was on the floor, I spent 11 hours on the floor of the House fighting to try to stop Obamacare, the health care law. What I was hoping to do is hold the House accountable for its rules. If I had been successful and we had postponed that vote for 2 weeks, every member of Congress would have returned home and had to face their constituents before they made that vote. If that had occurred, I believe we would have had a different outcome, and we would be considering the ways that we can lower health care costs instead of having the government take it over. I think it's very important that we move the free market forces and common sense reforms in to bring down the price of health care, and you got to start that with repealing health care.
And Congressman Moran.
I strongly oppose the health care reform bill and can find next to no merit in the provisions that are included in it. There are many things that we could do to improve access to affordable health care. I chair the Rural Health Care Coalition. It's a group of members of the House of Representatives who try to make sure that rural America doesn't get forgotten in healthcare debate, that we keep our hospital doors open, that we keep physicians in our communities. And this bill, the Obama-Pelosi health care bill, is damaging to that cause. This bill is bad in the broad sense, increasing taxes, dramatic increase in regulations and regulatory costs, and increasing ultimately the cost of health care, as I indicated earlier, as scored by the Congressional Budget Office and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It is bad for the general economy of the country. In fact, I talked to a business person in Kansas a few weeks ago, and she told me that they have outsourced their jobs at their company to another country so that they can get below the 50 employee threshold. It's counterproductive to creating employment in this country. We now have health care that's moving jobs outside the United States. This bill, however, is also bad from a Kansas alone perspective. The hometown doctor and hospital, I think it's the unstated aspect of this health care bill is fewer physicians, hospital doors closing, less access to Medicare for senior citizens, and the ability to train and educate physicians. Again, people are going to decide this is no longer the profession I want. I'm not working for the federal government, and there will be reduction in affordable health care because of this legislation, despite what the supporters say is its purpose.
And 30-second response, Congressman.
Well, let me first correct. I said repeal health care. I meant repeal Obamacare. Certainly we don't want to repeal health care. This is where leadership matters. While I was on the floor fighting this health care legislation, Congressman Moran was out shooting a campaign video. That's not how you get things done in Washington, D.C. You got to take the fight to the liberals, take the fight to the House leadership, the Democrats there, and do something important. I'm going to use the amendment process in the Appropriations Committee to repeal and replace health care, starting with the 16,000 IRS agents that we don't need in this health care that are designed to audit every business in America. It's time to repeal the Obamacare and put something with the free market in control back in place.
Crazy allegation. I spoke numerous times in opposition to health care, and mostly about the things I've already talked about. But one of the things I spoke about on the House floor as we discussed health care is my concern that this is a bill that once again sends a message to the American people that somebody else is responsible for their well-being. And the more people who come to the conclusion that government is going to take care of me, the less likely we'll ever be able to work our way out of that. It's why repeal, replacement with something better, and those common sense reforms that we know can work makes a lot of sense. This bill has to go away before too many people are dependent upon it for their health care and their employment.
30 seconds.
This bill is going to lead to rationing. It's going to lead to fewer opportunities in health care. There will be less physicians. Every nation in the world that has tried this has a worse health care system than before they started. I favor repealing it and replacing it with a free market system like H.R. 3400. I'm looking forward to Congressman Moran joining my efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare.
You have 30 more seconds?
I do have 30 more seconds.
Yeah.
This bill, as I said earlier, I was the first member of the House of Representatives to introduce legislation to repeal Obamacare. That bill passed the House of Representatives on a Sunday night, and on Monday morning our bill was introduced. Incidentally, it was not 2,000 pages, it was 2 sentences. So to John, the person who asked this question, I'm a strong supporter of repealing, again, thinking that there are many things that we can do to improve health care being more affordable, but unfortunately, none of them are in this legislation.
Okay, and we are back after this with viewer questions. And welcome back to the 27 News 2010 Republican Senate primary debate for Kansas. And this is our last round of questions, and these came from you at home submitted during the debate, and we'll have 1-minute answers and 1 round of 30-second rebuttals each.
That's right. Kelly received a number of emails before and during the debate on this topic, And this specific question comes from Mark in Topeka. He asks, you both differ greatly on loosening the trade and travel embargo with Cuba. Please explain, and we start with Congressman Moran.
I do believe that Kansas farmers ought not be penalized. Ranchers of Kansas ought not be penalized by policy that we put in place more than 40 years ago in this country. Sanctions don't generally work, but they certainly don't work when we're unilateral. And so I've worked hard to open up markets, not just Cuba, but the sale of beef to South Korea. We ought to be supporting the trade agreement that is now pending with Colombia and with Panama. Trade matters to us. 40% of what we produce in Kansas is exported, and it's not just agriculture. Boeing aircraft and general aviation manufacturing, this all matters. And so I've taken the lead on the effort to open up agricultural markets. And it's not, we're just taking money from Cuba. We're not even trading. This is sales for cash up front. And unfortunately, there were some regulations that were put in place that make that even more difficult that we're now trying to correct. So this is an effort on behalf of trying to increase profitability and success for Kansas farmers.
Congressman Tiahrt.
Well, I'm for free markets and free trade as well, and when it comes to South Korea, open up their markets for beef, same with Japan. I think it would be much more productive for the Kansas Farm Bureau and for Americans to pursue a trade agreement with Colombia. But I think where the difference is that Congressman Moran wants to change the policy in trade with Cuba. When Clinton was president, we were shipping goods and then hoping for payment from the Cubans later on. Keep in mind, you can only do business with one company when you import into Cuba. That company is owned by Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. And we found out that they weren't paying their bills. So President Bush changed the policy so that we didn't ship anything until we received the payment first. That worked. In fact, we're the largest importer of agricultural goods into Cuba today. Now Congressman Moran wants to not only change that policy, but open up some trade or travel policy with Cuba. It will only benefit the Castro brothers, just like trading with that one company. I don't think that we ought to give a credit card to Fidel Castro because he doesn't pay his bills, and that's why we changed the policy.
Okay. 30-second rebuttal.
None of these sales are on credit. They're all for cash up front, and it's worked well. In fact, we've sold over $1.2 billion worth of American agricultural products to Cuba. And I'm a supporter of freedom and liberty, freedom for American citizens to make decisions about where they travel. But also, I believe that engagement, and Ronald Reagan spoke about this, engagement with other countries increases the chances that they will enjoy freedom and liberty. I'm certainly no supporter of Fidel Castro and communism, but I think we can effectuate change by changing our policy.
30 seconds.
30 seconds for you.
Well, Congressman Moran ought to read his bill. It's ship first, pay later. That's a bad policy. The policy ought to be, if you want goods from America, you pay for those goods before we ship them to you because you have a very poor credit rating. Fidel Castro owes Americans it's tens of billions of dollars. He still owes Russia tens of billions of dollars. And for us to change the policy so that we have a ship first and pay later policy is a mistake, and I can't support that. But I do support free trade. I want to create Kansas jobs. I certainly want to export airplanes, and that's the best way to pursue it. Let's open up trade with Colombia, not Cuba.
Okay, now on to something that not a day goes by and we don't hear anything about this, the oil spill in the Gulf. Now, Republican Kentucky Senate candidate Rand Paul says accidents happen. Do you feel that you have those same thoughts, or is the government needing more oversight of those oil companies?
I think this one goes to Todd.
This one does go to Todd Tiahrt.
Well, thank you for the question. I think accidents do happen. I think that's a true statement. And I do think we need to hold BP accountable for this spill. It's the worst environmental disaster that we've seen in the history of this country. And we've got to hold them accountable. We also must learn from their mistake and make sure this never happens again. But did you ever ask the question, why are we drilling in 5,000 feet of water? That's almost a mile deep. If we'd been drilling in 50 feet of water or 100 feet of water, we wouldn't have had this problem because we could have capped off the well. The reason we pushed out there so far is because we have environmentalists that insist that we drill way out into the ocean. We have government policies that force these rigs way out. So we need to become energy independent in this country. It's a very important thing to do. We've been drilling for oil here in Kansas safely for over 100 years. So I think we should learn from the mistakes that BP has made, allow production of oil closer to our shores where it's more safe, and continue to move this country towards energy security.
I don't think you write off BP and the circumstance we face on our Gulf Coast as just accidents happen. I'm disappointed that the company apparently had no plans to respond to this kind of disaster. And I'm terribly disappointed in the Obama administration's failure to get all the bureaucracy out of the way so that we could keep the oil from coming ashore and begin the process of cleaning up this disaster. And so the government has been a handicap, not a help, and BP should have been better prepared than they were, and in my opinion, they have to pay for the cost environmentally and economically along the Gulf Coast. But it is a reminder that we need an energy policy. When we talk about creating jobs in the United States, one of the best things we could do is create jobs in the energy sector, and it's why I've supported a very comprehensive energy plan. It's why I strongly oppose cap and trade, one of the most damaging pieces of legislation ever to pass the House of Representatives when it comes to job creation and energy production. But we ought to be using wind, Kansas wind, solar, nuclear power, clean coal, and we ought to be exploring for oil and gas closer to our shores and in the United States.
Quick rebuttal.
Well, what Jerry said doesn't need rebuttal. He's right about that. The thing that upsets me about the Obama administration is that we could have had more help in the Gulf, but they wouldn't waive the regulations that prohibit it from coming in. Over 30 countries wanted to come in. My policy would be, until those oil skimmers are bumping into each other in the Gulf of Mexico, we don't have enough. So our administration has failed here. They continue to fail to lead on this policy, and I think that as Congress, we should hold them accountable for this big failure. It was handled a lot better when it was up in Alaska, when we had an oil spill there. It was still a terrible disaster. We've got to prevent these kind of disasters. This country does need to be energy secure, and we have to hold not only BP accountable, but this administration accountable, and let's allow companies to produce energy closer to our shores so we don't face this type of environmental disaster in the future.
You have 30 seconds if you want.
I do. What I would say is that cap and trade has passed the House of Representatives. Terrible mistake, damaging to the Midwest, damaging to farmers and agriculture, damaging to the consumers of our state. And we cannot afford to let President Obama use the disaster in the Gulf, this oil, to be his reason to champion cap and trade. We need to make certain that the Senate does not pass cap and trade. If we can get through this Senate, it means that it has to start over, and I hope the American people will use the November elections to send a strong message that this is another failed policy of the Obama administration.
And it is now time for closing statements. Each candidate will get a minute and a half before the debate. We flipped a coin to determine the order. First with his closing statement is Congressman Moran.
Well, first again, let me thank Channel 27 News for the opportunity to visit with folks, and especially to thank our viewing audience to give us an opportunity to explain who we are and what we care about. Our country faces tremendous challenges. I mean, they are real, and we need a sincere effort to change course. All my life, I've heard about how this is the most important election of a lifetime. And the reality is, I never believed it. People use that expression. They say we're at the crossroads, the country's got to change course, and I think those were just words. Today, I firmly believe it. What happens in 2010 and what happens in 2012 determines the future of our country. And we need to be thinking long term. This Congress, this administration is selfish. It's all long term to them is the next election. It's November. I think about my mom and dad in their 90s. Their whole life has been focused on how do we care for me and my sister, the next generation. Now they're thinking about how do we care for our grandkids, the next generation. And unfortunately, Washington, D.C. plays politics day in and day out, trying to Republicans score points on Democrats, Democrats score points on Republicans, and the goal ought not be anything but a better America. And I think about the servicemen that we paid tribute to earlier. I walked by the Lincoln Memorial, the Vietnam Wall, the Korean War Memorial. Not a person there was memorialized for their death and their sacrifice, but for anything other than the service to their country, for their family's future, and for the future of their country. And I'm there committed to trying to make certain that we take the right common sense principles and fight for them in our nation's capital.
And for your closing statement, Congressman Tiahrt.
Well, I want to again thank the sponsors for creating this opportunity to have a debate with Congressman Moran. And I agree that what he said about the great challenges that this country faces. Kansas has a decision to make. What type of a senator do you want? We're going to send a Republican to Washington, D.C., but will we send a leader? Will we send somebody who fights against taxes? Will we send somebody who's going to take the needs of this country, this state, and try to create a better opportunity for our kids and our grandkids? There are some differences between Congressman Moran and myself. I don't vote for tax increases. He's voted for 12 tax increases. I oppose death taxes. He has voted against a permanent elimination of the death tax. I think budgets matter. He apparently doesn't think budgets matter. So there are some clear differences. There are differences not only in taxes, but also in policies related to whether we give citizens rights to terrorists or not. There's significant policies on how we view Democrat leadership in the House of Representatives, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But the real thing that needs to happen for our future is that we have to do what's necessary to get this economy back on track. Using my business experience, making sure that we do the things necessary to get opportunity for our kids and grandkids is what we need to do now. I think I can provide that leadership, and that's why I'm asking for your support on August 3rd. I need your vote so that we can take this fight to Washington, D.C. and create a better tomorrow, a better future for our kids.
Thank you, and that's all the time we have for the 27 News 2010 Republican Senate primary debate for Kansas.
And we'd like to thank the candidates for coming here this evening and for agreeing to debate, and also for our co-sponsors for their support. I'm Kelly Stegeman, and for Dr. Bob Beatty and all of the 27 News staff, thank you for watching. And remember to vote in the August 3rd Kansas primary. Good night.
Our political coverage continues with President